Okay, we are going to get started. Everybody please take back their seats. Within 1 minute, we have a continuation of our discussions. Yeah. Okay, can I get everybody back to their seats?
I should have brought my healing bowl. Yeah. I never thought of it.
Okay. I'll see if I can say one more announcement here. Okay, everybody, we are going to start now. The bell has just clanged. And I'm so happy to do another introduction of the person who is going to do the introduction. And that is Kathy O'Flynn McGee.
Thank you. I can take that. I'll use this one for now. Good morning, everybody. It's terrific to be here, and I was really pleased when Geertje invited me to take a little small role in the day, and so it's fantastic to be here. It's a couple of years ago since Geertje and I just casually were talking in the corridor about this year, this important year, and we started talking about the possibility of a panel, which I think is always... I talked about it, and Geertje seemed to be in agreement, and and so 2.5 years later she came back and said, Kathy, I have a role for you, so here I am. It's great to be here, and I wanted to thank Susan for a fantastic, thought-provoking and leaving us with some questions that I think are really key, because so much in agreement with much of what you said. It's a really exciting time now to welcome our panel, and we have 7 individuals. We have 5 either teams or individuals presenting, and on my immediate right is Joan Anderson, and next to Joan is Marion Clauson. Next should be Catherine Haney, but I'm kind of going this way. We have Sheila Rankin Zerr. We have Francis Affleck, we have Ranjit Dhari, and we have Geertje Boschma, who some of whom you will know and some of whom you may not. Our format is that we are going to, each panelist is going to have 10 minutes to bring some insights and some thoughts about their particular topic, and there'll be a few minutes of transition between each speaker. If there's a really burning question, I'll invite you to ask it, but we're hoping that we might be able to leave the bulk of questions until everybody has had their little talk, if that's okay. And so without further ado, I'd love to invite my colleague, Joan Anderson, and you can see up here, critical scholarship in a practice discipline, history matters. And so, Joan, I welcome you up to the podium, and I will keep time, so please forgive me, I have to use my cell phone, there isn't a clock in sight.
Yes, so I have my watch here, and I'm going to put it down here. Thank you, Geertje, for inviting me. Thank you, Susan, for an inspirational talk this morning. I really enjoyed it. And Geertje, thank you for inviting me, and Catherine, for all your support. I really appreciated that. It's an honor to join you today, and a joy to see the achievements of faculty members, students, and staff, the robust programs of funded research, the innovative teaching programs, community engagement. The list goes on. And my congratulations to all of you, and to the director, Dr. Elizabeth Sawick, for your outstanding leadership. And as I listened to you, Susan, I thought, we can move forward. We will move forward, because we do have the leadership to move forward. I too acknowledge the land on which we stand, the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I feel privileged to have shared in the school's journey on this land. When Geertje invited me, she said she'd like me to speak about how I came to a post-colonial feminist perspective in my scholarship. Way back then, I should add, way back then. At first I thought I would ground my response in my own program of research, but on reflection, I felt the need to put Geertje's request in an historical context and the culture of scholarship in the school back then in the 1980s. So I'm going to confine my comments to the school in the 1980s. But first, I must acknowledge that our ideas at the time evolved by standing on the shoulders of giants in nursing and in other disciplines. And I quote from Sir Isaac Newton, "If we can see further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." And indeed, you told us about these giants this morning. And so we stand on the shoulders of these giants. I'm going to confine my comments to three main points: to give an historical snapshot, which I think was foundational to the development of different genres of critical inquiry, the launch of the PhD program in 1991, and subsequent programs of research in the school. And I think that we have to think of both of them together because they were intertwined. When I came back from doing my PhD, I returned to the school in 1981 after completing my PhD in sociology. We recognized at the time the need for research-intensive PhD programs across the country to strengthen the scientific basis of nursing practice. In 1983, Dr. Willman, the director of the school at that time, established a committee to look into the doctoral program. About a year later, Faculty Caucus approved the recommendation to develop a PhD program. I should point out that the 1980s were not easy times. We had to deal with a lot of budget issues. And I recently came upon the April 1985 publication of Nursing Today and Dr. Willman's comments. These are trying times for all, but also times of opportunity and challenge. I hope we will continue to address the problems together and to support one another and the school. These trying times did not deter us in our determination to develop a PhD program and to foster nursing research. We as a community, and I would stress, we as a community, not one person, not just a committee, but a community, we're committed to developing a research-intensive PhD program. And when I say community, I'm talking about the school. I'm also talking about the practice setting. I'm talking about the entire nursing community. Many people in the university community provided guidance and support. For example, Dr. Peter Larkin, Dean of Graduate Studies until 1984, and later became VP Research, and Dean Peter Sudfeld, they shepherded us through the process. They stressed the need for research within the school, and indeed we were able to meet this criterion, and the PhD program, as you know, was launched in 1991. This was a stimulating time in nursing science, and I just want to talk about research and critical scholarship in the 1980s. No.
I don't think it moved on that time, Joan. There you go.
Is that there?
Yeah.
Okay, research and critical scholarship in the 80s. This was a stimulating time in nursing science. It was a time when qualitative research as an interpretive and analytic science, underpinned by different theoretical approaches, feminist, post-colonial, post-structural, gained legitimacy. But what is very important is that we as a school respectfully embraced both quantitative and qualitative paradigms as legitimate methods of scientific inquiry. It wasn't an either or. but what was in the best interest of nursing science. And I want to thank Helen Elfert over there, who was a great advocate for, helping us through this time in looking at different paradigms of nursing inquiry. And indeed, we flourished in the 80s. Research in the school was in response to the needs of practice. Grants were small, but in the year 1980 to 81, there were 25 projects funded through a variety of sources. That's way back in the 80s, 81. That's quite significant. Momentum was sustained throughout the 80s with both internal and external funding. For example, the Sheena Davidson Research Fund was established in her memory in 1980, and Roberta Hewitt and Danelda Ellis were the recipients of the first grant from the fund in 1985. I started with small grants from UBC Shirk. Those days, you got $1,000 and you thought you got a lot of money. And so that's where I started. And then in 1983, Judy Lynham and I got a grant from Secretary of State for Multiculturalism. In 1984, Helen Elfert and I received funding from BC Health Research Foundation. And throughout the 80s, I got funding from BC Health Research Foundation. And later on, with Helen's encouragement, actually, to apply, I applied to the National Health for a National Health Research Scholar Award, which I received, and which provided salary and research support. What I'm stressing here, we worked in a very supportive environment. We worked as a community, and that was very important. And this research that Helen and I, Judy and I were doing at the time, and other research studies, they were in response to the needs in clinical practice at the time. With changes in Canada's immigration policies, healthcare providers wanted to know how to deliver culturally sensitive health care to newcomers from different ethnocultural groups, many of whom did not speak English. In some of our research with women living with a chronic illness, we were interested in how a woman's cultural beliefs shaped the way she managed her illness. But as we listen to women and compare the lives of low-income women with affluent women, we found that how they managed an illness could not be explained solely by cultural beliefs, important as these were. Financial resources and life circumstances had a huge impact on how a woman managed her illness. Putting food on the table for her family, for her children, was sometimes more important than buying her medicines. Not keeping an appointment might be because a woman couldn't take time off from work for fear of losing her job. These women were in low-income jobs, and they were not protected by a labor union. If they lost their job, they would have great difficulty finding another. Many of them did not speak English. So it was the narratives from women that guided me to different genres of critical theorizing, including feminist theories, post-colonial feminist theories, and critical humanism in my later research. These critical perspectives provided a different analytic angle. They shifted the focus from ethnic categories and cultural determinism to an understanding of how history and sociocultural economic context shape the experience of suffering. They expose the strong links between poverty and health. This awareness, I believe, can inform the way in which we promote health and well-being, and indeed it does. And it provides the basis for nursing care. It can provide direction for public and health policy. and it contributes to science-based advocacy for socially just health and healthcare practices. So I'd like to speak briefly, I think my time is going, so I'd like to speak briefly on practice-oriented teaching, knowledge exchange, policy. Praxis for me means action and practice based on research-driven critical knowledge. During my tenure in the school, I had the great privilege of teaching across programs, starting in the undergraduate program across to the master's, and when we had a PhD program, I taught in that program as well. And I thought I had a very fortunate position because I was able to use the research I was doing in teaching. And we developed a course way back then on the cultural context of health and illness, and I think the course got transformed throughout time and was integrated in different ways in the curriculum as time went on. So, you know, there was always the opportunity for engagement with teaching. And I also had the privilege of working closely with practitioners and administrators in practice. And many of our questions came out of practice. And, you know, we shared our research findings with health professionals who were very keen on speaking with us and telling us what the issues were in practice. So there was always a back and forth. The analytic power of critical theory helps us to focus on equitable health care, and it meshes well with the social determinants of health. And for the first time here in this province, there is a poverty reduction program. Some of my colleagues and I submitted a brief to the government, and we drew on some of our work, going way back to some of the insights from the 1980s, to show how we can interrupt the cycle of poverty to improve health. And that's the title of the brief we submitted to the government, and we had the opportunity to meet with the Minister of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. So in closing, I should just say that I think we have a great opportunity to move forward. Susan, I know the problems you have raised, but I think that there is a will to move forward, and I'm very optimistic that there is the leadership to move forward. And I hope that we can continue this dialogue today and leave here with a very firm plan for the future. And thank you again. It has been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Joan, and I'll invite you to have a seat, and we'll keep questions, I think, until the end. In the interest of time, I'd love to invite our next speaker, Marion Clauson, up to the podium. Marion does not need PowerPoint, so that's great. And Marion is going to talk to us about 5 decades of personal reflections in nursing education.
I'm really not that old.
And I'll sit right
You
there.
know I am.
Great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy, and Geertje, and Catherine, and Susan, and Joan for all that has been offered today. I'm delighted to be here. This is a special building on a special campus. I'm a UBC alumni of 1971 and 1992, and very proud of that. So this is really my story as a nurse educator. So it's grounded in my experiences, very much the lived experience of being an educator over those decades, and some of my observations and insights in that regard. So I was a student in the program, what was a 5-year program, a year of science and then 4 years of nursing, between 1966 and 1971. And we were, at the time, students that were kind of pariahs in the health system because we didn't know how to do some things during our clinical practice, but we had knowledge and we had evidence. And so they were challenging years as a student, but also very good ones. And I was privileged in my final year to take the teaching course that was part of the final year with Margaret Campbell. And to this day, I am so grateful for that experience. I didn't know at the time what kind of foundation that would offer me as an educator, but it certainly did. So I went into clinical practice for a little less than a year, and my area was maternal child nursing. And in 1972, I began as a teacher in the VGH School of Nursing with less than a year's clinical experience. Now at the time, we BSN grads were in high demand to fill some of those roles as teachers. So there I was, a very newbie teacher, working with the students in that program. And the format was that the students had one class day a week and 4 or more clinical days on the units. And I was there for the weekday days, supervising their clinical practice. And they did rotations through the maternity areas. The class days were heavily content focused. We had to blast through 8 hours of, content about babies and moms and postpartum and labor and delivery. And that's literally what I did. Class notes were already established. I just had to deliver them. And so as a new teacher, that's what I did. I don't think there were any labs per se, because I don't recall those. And all the clinical procedures and nursing care were learned on the unit through observations of the nurses with me as a guide. I didn't work the evening shifts or the weekend shifts, so I had no idea what was happening for the students when I wasn't there. But clearly they were learning something, I guess. My head nurse had to approve the rotations of my students. I didn't have any choice in that, although I did lobby for that. And so she was the one who decided which nurses or LPNs the students would buddy with. I learned to relate well to her, but she was very old school and I was very young. And I was often told that I was too young to be an instructor and that my teaching methods really weren't appropriate. There was no trust in my ability as an educator, and it was a very challenging relationship for several years. In 1975, I had an opportunity to teach at Langara College. And in 1975, it had a 2-year program, but the college itself was pretty new. Started in about 1970. So the nursing program was new. And when I started, I was tasked with developing a learning module on gynecology and obstetrics. And I was given the textbook, and I was told that I was to follow the textbook because that's what the students would be doing. So at least at the time, I now had my knowledge of behavioral objectives. Thank you, Margaret Campbell. But the content and the module was still very content-focused, and it followed the book. The students usually had 2 full days of clinical practice each week, along with their nursing courses, their biology, their English, etc. And so I was able to work with the students for those 2 full days in the clinical site. And I was in control of their patient assignments. So I got to work with the head nurse on the unit to say which would be the most appropriate patients for the students to work with. And I developed a really good relationship with the nursing staff over a 5-year time that I typically went back to the same unit for the clinical experiences. On busy days in labor and delivery, they would let me pitch in. And I learned to relate well with them, to collaborate with them, and they trusted me. They knew that my knowledge and my clinical skills were strong enough that what I was providing for the students was going to provide good nursing care for the patients. Excuse me, I just got a little bit of a residual cold. So while I had the opportunity with the students on the clinical practice days to really have them problem solve and think critically, this wasn't as much of a focus on class time as it might have been at the time. Remember, this is my experience. In 1980, I took a break from formal teaching in a way that I had two small children, and I just decided that was where I needed to be for a while. I did go back and teach some part-time summer courses at Langara, clinical course in gerontology, which was not my forte, one of the most challenging experiences I think I might have had in my experience as a clinical educator. And I taught prenatal classes for many years during that time. In 1987, in September, I started the UBC MSN program, part-time. And I struggled to learn the UBC model for nursing, which of course had come in while I was not there, and to figure out how I could think and write as a grad student. My blessing is that I had some amazing faculty members who guided me over that time, some of whom will know who they are because they're in this room. And I learned, as I took the education-focused courses, about educational theory and teaching methods and curriculum design and clinical teaching, and had the underpinnings now to support what I thought I was doing kind of intuitively as an educator. I could clearly see the differences between my experiences with RN diploma programs and the BSN program. And I had a teaching practicum where I could actually see what was happening with the students' focus on conceptual learning, critical thinking, and how they were integrating that into their practice, and that was invaluable for me. While I was doing the master's program, I took an opportunity to become a nurse manager for nursing and family education at BC Women's Hospital, at a time when nurse managers were just coming out of contract and becoming the suits and nails people that we were called at the time. It was my first foray into nursing management, a very interesting time. And while the nurse managers were out of contract, and that was a very new phenomenon for the hospital and for everybody, staff, the educational offerings for nursing staff, which was my portfolio, tended to be mandated by new policies and procedures and were less focused on specific learning needs of the nurses. This was frustrating for me, and I know I caused a few ruffles as I advocated for different approaches to in-service education. But 2 years later, I'd had enough of that, and I needed a change, and I needed to get back to teaching my way. So I began teaching in 1992 as an employee of the VGH School of Nursing, but at a time when the collaborative program was in effect. So I was finally arriving at UBC in what I had always thought would be my dream job, to teach at UBC. And there were a number of interesting years there as the VGH program was kind of gradually phased out. And by 1997, I had worked so hard to make myself indispensable to UBC that I actually became a UBC employee. I was determined. And actually, the options for me as a maternity-focused educator at VGH were just not there because there was no more maternity there. So the focus of education during these years was based on a very solid curriculum. Student learning was based on theory, concepts, and evidence. And the flexibility to use a variety of teaching learning strategies in the classroom and in clinical practice was mine. I had the opportunity to be involved in curriculum planning and in the development of the 20-month advanced standing BSN program, which was new at that time. Those students were admitted with partial or completed degrees following a rigorous screening and interview process. And these were experienced students. So they weren't new to learning. They were experienced, and they had certainly high expectations of faculty. And that enabled us, I think, in general, to shift a little bit to think about how we were meeting those expectations for learning of those students. And I think that was when we began to shift to a more learner-centered approach to what we were doing in the BSN program. There were many innovations in teaching and learning that emerged during this time, including the use of learning technologies, simulation learning, and all kinds of different things that were supporting what was happening for students and for faculty. I think it was over this period of time that conceptual learning, critical thinking, problem solving, relational practice, ethical practice, nursing leadership and health policy, and all of how those underpin and support excellent clinical practice became the hallmarks of what students were learning in the BSN program. At the same time, university-wide initiatives were focused on supporting faculty to learn more about innovative teaching and learning strategies and that were learning-centered. And so what was most exciting for me finally was to become the guide on the side for students instead of the sage on the stage. In 2005, while still teaching in the baccalaureate program and also began teaching in the MSN program, I had the unique opportunity to be part of a partnership between UBC School of Nursing, UVic School of Nursing, the two health authorities being Vancouver Coastal Health and Fraser Health, and the BCNU, the Nurses Bargaining Association. This partnership had a vision to develop an integrated education model that would build nurse educator capacity in the health authorities by developing nurse educator competencies through a leveled program. The program was federally funded for 3 years from 2007 to 2010. So I had the opportunity to work closely with health authority nurse educators and other partners to develop, implement, and evaluate a 4-leveled curriculum for clinical nurse educators. We developed core competencies related to education theory and practice, and these were designed to meet the needs of preceptor mentors in the health authorities, clinical educators who were supporting either individuals or groups, and also those nurse educators who were interested in educational leadership via a master's program. We developed workshops collaboratively that included many innovative learning strategies with maximum intent to engage the participants and practice learner-centered facilitation of learning. So we weren't talking about teaching, we were talking about facilitating learning, which again was a shift that was happening and quite a dramatic shift within the health authorities for sure. I co-facilitated many workshops with my health authority colleagues. They helped me to be grounded in the realities of clinical practice environment in which the clinical educators were immersed. And I helped them to incorporate the educational theory and evidence base to support the curriculum goals and objectives of the leveled workshops. The funded partnership, thanks Kathy, almost done. The funded partnership ended in 2010 as I was retiring. But I was supported by Vancouver Coastal Health and Fraser Health to remain involved in that educator pathway program for the next 5 years. I continued to co-facilitate workshops, collaboratively review and revise curriculum, and contribute to the ongoing evaluation of the program. And finally, I was able to develop a knowledge translation strategy, and I used a train-the-trainer model to offer the educator pathway to nurse educators in Northern Health and Interior Health authorities. In many ways, this felt to me like coming full circle. I was back working with educators in practice settings, and I think really taking my experience to engaging with them in practice settings around the facilitating of learning. And I think that what we came to was being learning-centered, not learner-centered. Very rewarding. So thank you. That's my story.
Thank you so much, Marion. I'm so glad that you mentioned the UBC model of nursing, because many of you in the room know it. And up next we have Geertje. I think you're up next. Yeah. So no, Geertje needs no introduction, but she is going to talk to us about theorizing nursing and the UBC model of nursing in context. So it's a very nice follow-up, and that was not orchestrated. Thank you so much, Marion. Thank you, Geertje.
Super. Thank you. I hope I'm done in 12 minutes. That is my goal. I start right away. I must say that I come to the model out of context because I learned as a person coming from the Netherlands to the North American scene. And so that is also the context to my presentation. In the 1970s, UBC nursing faculty enthusiastically embraced the nursing theory movement and developed the UBC model of nursing. Helen Shore, who was on the committee charged with the UBC curriculum model design in 1971, remembered it well. It was an exciting time. Reflecting back, she finds it fascinating how the idea of nursing has evolved over time, from a very basic idea at the time of Nightingale and at the era of public health, through to what she called to the exciting era of model building. According to Helen Shore, it was one of the most creative processes going on in the 1970s. In fact, faculty tried to adapt nursing and nursing theory to rapidly changing and shifting circumstances. UBC faculty engaged with model building in response to changes in nursing and healthcare. The nursing theory movement, that is, the urge to develop theory-based nursing curricula, was closely connected with the pressing need in the 1950s and 60s for more baccalaureate nursing education to generate more adequately prepared nurses for leadership positions at the time of severe shortage of healthcare personnel around the world. Former Director of Nursing Education at VGH, who has already been brought up, Helen Musalem, and also the first Canadian nurse to obtain a PhD degree in 1962, had just completed an influential survey on nursing education in 1960. And Susan mentioned that as well, Spotlight on Nursing Education. Based on this study, in which also the later UBC director Muriel Upritchard had a role, she wrote a report for the Royal Commission on Health Services in 1964 on the status of nursing education in Canada. By the late 1960s, the idea of nursing as an academic discipline expanded in earnest, even though its early beginnings, like here, started much earlier. According to Helen Musalem, the point was not only to find more, but to create more and better qualified nurses. And hence he strongly advocated for more baccalaureate and eventually more graduate nursing education that Joan also has talked about. The pressure to base nursing practice and education on better scientific theory evolved. Still, influential nursing ideas existed. We were not the first. The conceptualization of the nursing process and care plans, for example, had been built on ideas of social casework in public health and social work starting in the 1920s and 30s. In the 1950s, Virginia Henderson clarified for a world audience the essential or unique function of the nurse. Her definition of nursing was a hallmark for nursing educators and leaders around the world. The unique function of the nurse is to assist the individual, sick or well, in the performance of those activities contributing to health or to its recovery, or to a peaceful death, that he would perform unaided if he had the necessary strength, will, or knowledge, and to help gain independence as rapidly as possible. And I emphasize he for a reason. She aligned fundamental nursing notions with insight from psychology, such as Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. In 1952, Hildegard Peplau offered a groundbreaking conceptualization of the nurse-client relationship as a relational, interpersonal practice based on leading psychiatric insights. To translate these ideas for a Canadian nursing audience, University of Montreal nursing faculty member Evelyn Adams wrote a similar text. First in French in 1979, and then translated in English in 1980 to Be a Nurse. Helen Musalem, by then executive director of the Canadian Nurses Association, called Adams' book a milestone in nursing thought because of the clarification it provided of what nursing and its practice are and what being a nurse entails. Adam herself was even more explicit about her goals. In her foreword to her book, she noted how the religious and military nursing heritage was well known, and strong for that matter. However, she said, our theoretical and scientific roots are unfortunately much weaker, leaving nurses not only malnourished intellectually, but also inaptly equipped to the weather of the 1960s political healthcare storms. And she said, if a profession's theoretical base is not strong, its members may change direction needlessly because of pressure from political or technological influences. Nurses had little political say, or simply were not listened to at the policy-making tables. To the concern of these leaders, that had to change if nurses were to influence post-war health science services in dire need of care. Nationally, insights on the need for healthcare also changed. The influential report in 1974 by Lalonde on the health of Canadians confirmed that health was not solely a medical matter or one of hospital expansion alone, but lifestyle, environmental influences, and the health education were seen as equally important to maintain people's health. Lalonde's plea evolved around the influential insight that health was socially determined as much as it was medically so. In nursing, a university degree began to be seen as a necessity, not only to provide a solid educational foundation to the practice discipline, but also to legitimize nursing as an essential player in the rapidly changing healthcare field. Nursing scholars of new academic programs, who many of here are in the room, sought connections with allied disciplinary fields in social and behavioral sciences and in education to articulate a more adequate theory base in nursing and to liberate themselves from medical domination. The introduction of a theory-based curriculum was in line with these developments, strongly influenced by US nursing and soon imported to Canada. The effort to develop conceptual frameworks and models for academic nursing programs had high priority, also at UBC. Nursing educators and practice leaders sought to define what was unique about nursing and nursing knowledge, so they could draw attention to practice phenomena of interest to nursing and help guide nurses in their clinical reasoning. A new generation of nurse theorists embraced core concepts from social and behavioral science and education to articulate the way nursing phenomena hang together. Human needs, stress, adaptation, systems theory were readily imported concepts understood to be useful for nursing. One of these nursing theorist pioneers was Dorothy Johnson from the University of California at Los Angeles nursing faculty. She argued that whereas physicians focused on the diagnosis of imbalance and abnormality in patient biological systems, nurses should focus on the diagnosis of imbalances and abnormalities in patients' behavioral systems and describe how a person achieved balance or equilibrium in life and not only in the body. She articulated a general theory of the individual as a behavioral system comprised of 7 subsystems. As such, she no longer depended on biomedical theory to describe what nurses did. Other theorists, such as Johnson's students Callista Roy and Dorothea Orem, developed nursing theories based on core concepts as adaptation and self-care. The National League for Nursing Education in the US not only promoted these ideas, as shown by the guiding booklet they published, but they also made the use of theoretical models a mandatory requirement in US nursing education. And the Canadian nursing profession took a similar step in the mid-1980s. Theory-based curricula became necessary. In response to these pressures, the UBC faculty took a bold step. First, when Muriel Apritchard, an expert in education and curriculum studies, came to direct the UBC School of Nursing in 1971, she encouraged the faculty to shift to a theory-based curriculum. Geertje came from UCLA, where she had been a direct colleague of Dorothy Johnson. She brought with her 4 new faculty members who had studied with Johnson and who interspersed among the existing faculty the idea of a behavioral system model. Within 2 years, the group obtained Senate approval for a new curriculum despite much internal rivalry and resistance. And I have to thank in part Sally Thorne for keeping us abreast of these developments by making sure that this story is still on our website in the school and is published widely as well. Secondly, building upon the work of Dorothy Johnson, the faculty not only developed its own behavioral systems model, but also gave it an interesting conceptual twist. In a model of 8 behavioral subsystems depicting man's basic and allegedly universal needs as a holistic framework of man, the model committee, of which Helen Shore was part, for example, gave further depth to the nurse's role by adding how nursing was also concerned with the meaning a person attached to their human experience and critical periods in their life, drawing from psychological field theory. Within the UBC model, students were taught to not only observe the what of behavior, but also to interpret the how of ways individuals tended to cope with critical periods and events affecting their life space and cycle. Hence, not only the state and balance of the subsystems was identified, guided by the model, but also the essential subjective meaning humans attached to critical periods and their ability to cope were assessed, and depending on need, then supported by the nurse. In this way, the committee, under the capable leadership of Margaret Campbell, bravely embarked on an original articulation and incorporation of existing nursing, psychological, and educational ideas. The UBC model of nursing was born. Faculty generated tools for nursing assessment and began to collaborate with practice agencies to apply these ideas in the organization of nursing practice. When Purvik Pavilion, for example, opened adjacent to the school in 1977, first director Mary Cruz and her successor, Rose Murakami, who you see here. Is that true? Yes. Who both had been on the UBC model building team, implemented into guiding practice in the new extended care facility. Over time, the UBC model lost its central place in the curriculum and in practice, as did the various other models developed in nursing. Although many of the nursing ideas these scholars articulated are still of value today, many other questions were not answered within the parameters of what were in the end were quite generic and individualistically oriented frameworks. A significant assumption of most models that they served to address all universal needs, for example, soon was challenged. What if the universal man was a woman, for example? Or what if basic human needs were rethought from the viewpoint of basic human rights or health equity? A population perspective also evolved, as did a critical understanding of culture and health. In addition, from a technological and managerial point of view, new questions emerged as well. How to align nursing documentation and administrative processes, for example, with new 1990s context of standardization, computer automated processes and informatics. Or how to approach workforce issues and planning when nursing diversifies. And other questions abound. So in conclusion, nursing models situated in time are inspiring for the way they probed us to question concepts fundamental to nursing. Therefore, I very much agree with Helen Shore's enthusiastic assessment of the nursing theory movement as an exciting time. It pushed nurses to think, to reflect, and to design frameworks to optimize and respond to the shifting circumstances of nursing and healthcare. But fundamental concepts of nursing and the ways in which nursing is organized inevitably have to be questioned, analyzed, or reinvented, just because the context of nursing and healthcare continues to change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geertje. I was just, thinking about what Marion said about educational theories, and I'm looking at Anne Wyness, with whom I taught many years ago, but it's really important every 20 minutes or so to shift the energy a little bit. I can feel the energy. We've been sitting for 45 minutes, so I wanted to invite everyone just for 30 seconds to do something that might shift our energy. Now, if your balance isn't great, or if your mobility isn't great, I encourage you to do it sitting down. For those of you who feel they'd like to stand up, it's really quick. Okay, so once you're up, what I'm going to ask you to do is, with your right hand and arm, you can keep it down by your side, you can put it up, you can put it out. I want you to make a circle, a big O, a big O, a big O. And then with your left foot, continue with your circles, and with your left foot, you want to make an X. If anybody can do it. The brain does not like this one, but just shifting our energy. Thank you so much for engaging in that.
Oh, you're full. I'm going to sit in a warmer seat. Yeah. I'm just freezing from that window.
I think we needed that. Thank you so much for engaging in it and having a little bit of fun. As I say to the undergraduate students, the work that we do in nursing is very serious. It doesn't mean that we can't have fun learning about it. So I'm delighted to welcome up to the podium colleagues Sheila, Rankin, Zerr and Catherine Haney, and they're going to be talking about the history and development of distance and online education in Canadian nursing. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kathy. Well, I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to speak about my journey in nursing education with distance education. And I'm also very happy to be working with my colleague here and my brilliant partner, Catherine. The chance to promote distance education is a deeply ingrained passion of mine. Having been born and raised in rural British Columbia, university was out of the question for me when I graduated from high school due to distance and finances. Having the opportunity to be involved in bringing distance education courses to nurses in rural areas in Ontario, British Columbia, Canada, and beyond was the highlight of my teaching career. My experience in moving from hospital to nursing education to computer-based learning has been astounding. And you can see from this picture, I'm a little bit cold. I was sitting by the window there, so forgive me while I'm trying to warm up here. This is a picture of me in my very first teaching assignment. That was the Ottawa General Hospital. It was a hospital-based program, and I spent all my time in the clinical area, and I taught my nursing through the clinical area, which was a great experience. And the babies, it was pediatrics, and my little tiny office had a window to the babies on the other side, so they used to talk to me. Okay, on to 1970s. Here I was, by this time I was on to the University of Ottawa, and they pioneered some of the early techniques to take university lectures to the rural areas and the small towns of the Ottawa Valley. And it was under Dr. Beverly Degas, who's a graduate from UBC, her leadership. The courses originated at the university lecture room and were then beamed out to designated classrooms where registered nurses had access to university credit in education, a great step forward. The School of Nursing at the University of Ottawa was housed in the engineering building in the 1970s. Computer technology was developing all around us, and I caught the bug. I developed a 78-page teaching tool that involved strategies for drug education for the nurse. This tool was eventually to become a computer-based program. The program was called Tic-Tac-Toe for Pill Pushers, a computer-based program, eventually, hopefully. The program, the average learner was, the strategies were into three different tracks, and they were, the tick was the slow learner, toe was the average learner, and tic-tac-toe, tick was the slow learner, tack was the average one, and toe needed more information. It was interesting to develop this program, and you can see by my son actually drew the tic-tac-toe people, and it was, the program was developed, and it was, the research was supported by the ASA company, the Bayer company. The research grant helped us to take it out, do a pilot study, which actually showed positive learning advances. The next step that we would take then would be to take the program and put it into a computer-based program and develop it in that way. But in the 1980s, the opportunity to retire and return to British Columbia was not missed. I could not miss it. An offer of a faculty position at the University of Victoria with Dr. Dorothy Kurgan to develop and deliver distance education courses sealed the deal. Unfortunately, I never got to the computer-based program for tic-tac-toe, but I stepped into the most challenging experience of my teaching career. Here, I was to teach Nursing 301, Clinical Studies in Nursing, on TV, on the Knowledge Network. This course consisted of nursing care planning. We used the Roy model. Sorry, UBC, we didn't use the UBC model, but we used the Roy model. And communication was a big part of the course. But then there was a section that was a complete physical head-to-toe assessment. The content of the course was blended with paper and with the distance TV delivery. And by the way, one of the TV courses that was given at that time was a joint course between U of Vic and UBC, and some of you may have been involved in that joint course. Anyone here involved in that joint course? Anyway, I have to tell you, delivering courses on TV was a huge challenge, and you can see here I am sitting, just a talking head, and you can be sure I had a lot of complaints from not only the students, but from my nieces and nephews. They used to sit and watch and laugh. Anyway, at that time, by the way, I was involved with Dr. Susan Duncan in that collaborative program. That's how we got to know each other. That was also a really exciting time. But I'm dealing with distance education here. Anyway, in the 1990s, Cheryl Entwistle convinced me to come and join the team here and stop going back and forth across the water because I never did live in Victoria. So I was quite happy to come here and not have to take the ferries anymore. But I enjoyed working with my work here. I worked with, the first course I worked with was Issues in Professional Nursing with Lynn Essen, and that was a great delight to work with Lynn. My final course working here at UBC was with Teaching and Learning, the Leadership and Management course with Janet Walker, and that was certainly an interesting course. It was quite a journey from, clinical teaching, in the pediatric ward to actually teaching full courses on computer-based learning. So that was my experience, but I'm going to turn it over to Catherine now, and she's going to give her perspectives. I don't have to work the computer, so I'll go sit down.
No, I'm so nervous. Thanks. Oh, I'm going to get really big. Okay. Thank you so much, Sheila, for sharing your experiences and your expertise with the innovation and implementation of distance-based and computer-based strategies. We're so privileged to hear firsthand how those seeds were conceived and planted by brave souls who took on the challenge in the context of and in reaction to new and ever-growing technologies that is in shifting and perhaps uneasy techno-realities. Indeed, I've heard just a few nursing educators who were initially reluctant to embrace this new avenue. So with that in mind, Sheila, your presentation reveals that you're a pioneering force, here you are, who has made valuable contributions to this history. So we're so happy to have you. To get some sense of our collective experience in this room, I'm keen to poll us. By a show of hands, how many have engaged in distance and computer learning as a student? Yeah. And as a teacher or educator? Excellent. So combined, I think it accounts for almost everyone in this room, or a hefty amount, not to mention the people who are joining us on webcast. So this display of hands, at least to some extent, shows that in today's academic climate, nursing has embraced online and distance education despite initial or persistent misgivings. So for this part of our joint presentation, I'd like to reflect on the ongoing uptake of online and distance education by nursing at the theoretical level. As always, we begin with a working definition, and this comes from Karen Firth, who's an American professor of nursing. She says that distance and online education comprises planned learning. It offers different place from teaching. It requires real or time-delayed technology and is structured and measured. Currently, we can recognize some of those elements in Sheila's work, but Firth also notes that in current distance education, it's synonymous with internet-based technologies. I'm just going to skip right ahead.
Take an extra 2 minutes. I just wanted to give you that time.
Okay. But I do want to highlight 3 points in particular that showcase the historical theoretical roots that have clearly endured until present day, and in my experience remain valued as core principles. And these include unboundedness, student-centeredness or learner-centeredness, and multisensory experience. I think they well highlight the connection between past and present and are worth briefly exploring and see if they ring true for you. In terms of unboundedness, distance education strives to break down barriers around who can be a learner and where and when learning can happen. It also expands the range of who can be a teacher, and as a hopeful future educator, I find that quite significant. In this way, I see that online and distance education is grounded in principles of equity and fair accessibility, and those principles similarly hold true in the second tenet of student-centeredness, which I think ultimately supports student empowerment. Firth tells us that those students are seen as capable decision makers, they are active participants, and are given opportunity to make choices about their own learning. In general, then, this approach moves toward leveling the hierarchy between professor and student in an effort to increase learner empowerment to contribute to immediate academic success and pave the way for ongoing and future self-directed learning in a variety of environments, including clinical practice. This ideological commitment to empowerment extends to the other element of distance and online learning, which is the ability to deliver and engage in multisensory experiences that go beyond the traditional lecture style and textbook learning. But of course, as a practice discipline, nursing does enjoy a long history of hands-on, in-person, clinically oriented education. So distance and online strategies offer additional opportunities for educators in the academic context to tap into those multiple styles of learning and to develop innovative and creative approaches to pedagogy. And that's proven to be beneficial for traditional and non-traditional students, and I imagine is rewarding and stimulating and empowering, and you can tell me this, for traditional and non-traditional educators. Okay, I'm going to switch ahead to a very personal note. As a longtime student, very long and practicing nurse, I want to express my gratitude for the persistent enthusiasm and commitment of educators to developing and delivering online and distance education, and for continuing to uphold those vital historical theoretical roots. I never would have made it to nursing practice, let alone grad school, without you. And I look forward to hearing about your experience from the other side of the keyboard, as it were, in the discussion or at lunch, which is almost coming up. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sheila.
Thank you both, Catherine and Sheila, so much. And last but very much not least, I'm going to invite Ranjit and Francis up to the podium, and they're going to talk a little bit about Wellness Wednesdays and perhaps some new innovations in clinical education.
Great, no worries. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it is afternoon by now, lunchtime, hopefully soon. So it's a great honor to be here in front of all of you to be talking about the undergrad program, the BSN, and talking about students being in clinical practice. But I do want to take this moment to thank everyone, Geertje, for inviting both Francis and myself to be part of the panel. And then to all my colleagues on the panel, I know many of you. I want to say thank you to Susan, who I believe at one point we were both working together for Vancouver Health Department for the city. And then Gilda, I think, was there at the same time in public health nursing. So we go way back. And then I go way back with Joan Anderson, Dr. Anderson, because I was one of the research assistants on the chronic, I think, project back in the 1990. I think it was, I took off to have babies and left her to the project. So we're going to be talking about Wellness Wednesday, and I'm just going to be providing a context of what that was about for us in clinical practice in our course in primary healthcare. And then Frances, who actually took it and ran with it, is going to be talking about her experience of creating it and tweaking it and then having it actually with the students in practice. So this morning we heard about how public health nursing is being decimated, and it's sadly getting worse and worse, but that there's maybe some hope and inspiration we can take from primary health care. So in our new BSN curriculum that rolled out in 2017, we have a course in it called Primary Health Care, which then rolled out in 2018 fall, September. And so one of the things we had in that course in clinical practice, so it's called Primary Health Care Nursing Practice, is that we had a day, what we called Wellness Wednesdays. And so it is taking that concept of primary health care, community health nursing, public health, combining it all, and then going out into the community and providing services to those, again, bringing that issue of social justice, that we are now having challenges in providing services to communities that maybe aren't having the same access to services that maybe at one time began. So standing again on the broad shoulders of public health nurses like Lillian Wald, who was the founder of public health, then this wellness concept was developed. So basically, we want to talk about, in terms of looking at the primary health care, if you think about it, and they have some understanding, there's 5 principles primary health care is based on. One is accessibility. So this was the intent of our Wellness Wednesdays, was to take the services where the population was, where our people were, and especially those who could not access those services because of the conditions maybe that they were in. And then secondly, the other one is in sectoral cooperation, so working with our community partners, our agencies, our stakeholders. And then thirdly, it talks about also then having appropriate technology. And from Francis' presentation, you will see that the students were very much engaged in any of that. It has also about public participation and health promotion. And so we took that concept of health promotion and created the Wellness Wednesdays for our students to engage in learning about clinical practice. The other tenet that we used was the Minnesota model. So Dr. Elizabeth Sawick will maybe know this very well. She's from Minnesota and was involved in it. So one of the models that we had taught in our previous curriculum, in our old curriculum, was what's known as the public health nursing intervention model, which comes from Minnesota. Public health nurses over there developed this model. And we had also taught it in our previous curriculum. And so it was part of the theory course in this new curriculum. That we took it forward into our primary health care course. And so we wanted the students to be connecting the theory of primary health care that they were learning about, and then the model in terms of the public health, and then taking that into their practice and connecting theory and clinical practice together. Okay. So we've got the good old TB nurses out there. So again, taking old ways of doing things forward to new ways. So those of you who maybe have worked out in the community, in public health, the nurses still have suitcases, but they're just now called more nursing, public health nursing bags. But when we do go out to do immunizations, so we've heard about the measles outbreaks that have been going on, we actually take suitcases on rollers packed with all our immunization supplies, because otherwise there's too many bags to carry. And so we actually, nurses do go out there with our suitcases and trying to do, again, that illness prevention and communicable disease prevention.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the practical aspect of rolling this out. So within these community settings, there were opportunities for each student to engage with a broad range of people. The settings included 3 community centres, one of which was specifically connected to BC Housing and mental health clients, 2 not-for-profit organizations, one of which was a day program for older adults with disabilities, and the other provided outreach services and shelter to marginalized populations, and 2 inner-city funded low-barrier outreach programs. The students developed and reframed their projects to fit the various settings and populations served. The following photos will reflect various aspects of the Minnesota Wheel that the students were applying. This photo reflects the health teaching spoke and is consistent with the goals of the Ministry of Health around injury prevention and prescription compliance. Originally developed for the Developmental Disabilities Day program and then broadened to include child safety tips and poisoning risks for a health fair poster presentation. The quotes with each of the photos, like this one, getting experiences we wouldn't usually get in the normal clinical setting, are from student evaluations of the Wellness Wednesday initiative. Here we see application of both the screening and health education spokes as the students used information and tools provided through the World Diabetes Day. The Diabetes Day was particularly meaningful as many people were interested, and a lot of broad health teaching could be discussed based on their assessments using the CAN risk tool. Here we see an example of the social marketing spoke in relation to raising awareness of men's health. These Health Canada fact sheets were key conversation starters in multiple community settings. One of the 5 principles of primary health care is the use of appropriate technology. As you have seen, we used various posters and handouts, but we also used laptops for youth, and for Youth Night we used physical props such as the LRC skeleton, went on a field trip, and pig's lungs complete with bellows and tar. This quote, we think, speaks to how mindful we and the students were as we entered each of these settings. I am always wary of college students with relative privilege entering into underserved communities as a learning experience, as it often feels exploitive. Wellness Wednesdays did not feel like that, but rather felt like students using their knowledge and resources to provide information and resources to people who might not have access to them. This photo speaks to the types of outreach the students were able to engage in and the opportunities these provided for them to hone communication and relational practice skills. The following video, Bridget and Andrew describe their personal experiences engaging in this Wellness Wednesday initiative. Where's the sound? Hello? Can we get the sound?
Sure. So we can go ahead and start.
Go back to the beginning.
How do I get it back to the beginning? I can't see it. How do I get it back to the beginning? I can't see the cursor. Sorry.
Bridget and Andrew. Thanks. Good morning, Bridget and Andrew. Thank you for taking the time to chat about our first wellness initiative.
Okay, you click the arrow.
Yeah.
It'll start playing, but don't do it yet, please.
Good morning, Bridget and Andrew. Thank you for taking the time to chat about our first wellness initiative. I was hoping we could begin with your perspective of the overall community engagement opportunities we had as a large group, and then have you each more specifically describe the health teaching and conversations you had in the smaller community settings.
Sure. I think for me, one of the biggest things I got out of Wellness Wednesday was the variety of community populations that we worked with. It allowed me to interact with populations of the downtown east side, with ESL learners at a neighborhood house, as well as youth for tobacco and smoking reduction. So we kind of went right across the spectrum in a very short amount of time. So that was really beneficial for me.
Yeah, I'd say same for me. Also, it helped me to kind of humanize these populations that we talk about in theory, but to actually be out where they live and work and have their whole lives, and to be able to see how their lifestyle impacts their health in a more human way was a really valuable lesson.
Nice to say. And what about individually? You both had kind of different experiences, and then you had an interesting one together. How was that?
Yeah, I can remember a lot of individual moments I had. I found that the Diabetes Awareness Day, I really enjoyed that, like working one-on-one with people who were genuinely interested in what they could do to prevent themselves from getting type 2 diabetes. So I remember a lot of conversations like that. And I found, personally for me, I did the ESL thing at the neighborhood house, and I found that population was really interesting to work with, because I did it with a classmate, Eddie, and before we went in, we realized we would have to first come up, essentially teach them certain terms we want to use. So I thought I learned a lot about working with that population, that if you have the time, come up with some like common definitions for terms you want to use before you start to go into the education. So I think I learned a lot in that one.
I went with another colleague, Chris, to the Developmental Disabilities Association, and that was a first for me. I had never had to do teaching that was adapted to a different type of learning need. So that was a really good experience to not only to present to that population, but also to develop materials beforehand that would be suitable to getting a message across. So we taught them, I guess, about staying active and did some exercise, and that was really well received and just a good experience overall. And yeah, I would say that Diabetes Awareness Day and the teachings we did during the Seniors Fair was really well received. And I think it was a good experience for us to sort of bring what we know from a really theoretical and science-heavy level and translate that to more appropriate teaching for patients and how they can really implement things into their life and lifestyle modification.
Yeah. And one thing I'd say about that is I actually shadowed and watched another set of students do their presentation at the Developmental Disabilities Association, and comparing that to my experience with the ESL folks who were all around middle age, I realized you really need to know your population, because the approach to folks at the DDA was quite different than the ones at the ESL Center. Because although there was a language barrier, they were all middle-aged adults, and in their prior countries, in their own languages, they were quite familiar with these health topics, so you could approach it in a very different way than the folks did at the DDA. I think that's really key when you're working with these populations.
Yeah. And so I was really pleasantly surprised at how receptive the public was to everything you guys were teaching in each of the groups, the big and the large, and also how each of you took your small piece that you were teaching and translated it to the various populations, as you said, adapted. The diabetes teaching translated to lots of different places, the men's health stuff. So that was nice.
Overall, do you think the experience helps students be more mindful of actual and potential barriers to wellness that may exist within the various population?
That would be a definite yes for me, and I think for the group overall, even in debriefing our experience afterwards with our other peers. Yeah, it was a really good way to see the social determinants of health that we talk about so broadly, but actually, like especially in the downtown side, to see what people are eating, where they're sleeping, how much they slept, and how much that impacts their health, and also to get a personal take on their lives, because they would often open up to us and talk about things that they've experienced in the past, and just to see, we talk a lot about trauma-informed care, but to see the use of that in actuality was a really good experience.
Yeah, I would say I had a similar experience, especially in the downtown east side, talking to people about, for example, like following up with a clinic, and realizing a lot of them either didn't have a clinic, didn't know where they were, or had moved around quite often. And you really see that when you start getting to that point where you're trying to tell them how to get to the next step, that there are a lot of barriers. It'd be hard to piece together the system just built in silos all over, especially if you don't have a fixed address.
Well, thank you very much for taking this time. I'm very grateful for having you in my group and for this opportunity.
Yeah, it's a pleasure for me to do this actually, because it's one of the better things that I've done over this program. So thank you, Francis.
Thank you.
For them to end with that. So we did do evaluations, and so Frances with her students rolled out some evaluations, and so we had 24 respondents in terms of the students that filled out, and it was then a compromise of 7 questions using the Likert scale, and then we had 3 narrative questions that the students completed. And so as you can see on the slide, that the response was again very positive. So we had 9 students that said that they strongly agreed, 7 felt that they agreed, and then 4 were neutral, I think, and then 3 that disagreed and 0 that didn't agree. And in terms of the ones that disagreed, initially we had put some students in adult daycare program, and that didn't work out well, so we had to actually then take them out of that and put them into what these Wellness Wednesdays was. So it was a switch much later. So we're not sure, but we wonder if it was those students that then didn't like what happened at the beginning with their clinical. Part of it is that this was a way done to try and meet the needs of our placement. We were not allowed to be on Wednesdays at the clinical placement setting that we'd been accepted, so it had been created as a way to meet that need and still provide a rich opportunity to learn in the clinical setting. And so there we are. This is, again, we heard about the public health nursing. So this is the first graduating class back in 1921 with a big focus on public health. And so we hope we have honored their legacy with the work we're doing in the Wellness Wednesdays in the primary health care course.
Thank you both so much. And so I know that lunch is waiting for us, and I do want to give everyone an opportunity to even think of a question. During the lunch break, I know you'll be able to connect with all of our panel, but it would be really nice for everyone to hear if there is a burning question that you'd like to ask. And just as a reminder, we started off looking and listening about critical theoretical perspectives in nursing and in nursing education, really key from the 80s in the UBC School of Nursing. Listening to, I hope I did I say 5 decades earlier? I had a horrible feeling I said 50. And I thought, oh no, 5 decades of personal reflections in nursing education and including things like really cool initiatives in BC, like the Educator Pathway. Geertje is there. And so looking at the UBC model and theorizing nursing, very important. Distance and online learning and its development and where we've been and where we've come, it's unbelievable. And then finally, Wellness Wednesdays and looking at how public health is playing out these days. So in a very efficient way, I think if we can work together to, ask questions, be really succinct, and see who you would like to ask the question of, or perhaps there's a question that everybody could answer. It's up to you, but we won't spend more than 10 minutes, if that's okay, because lunch looks great. Yes.
Hi there, my name is Netta and I'm in the MSN MPH dual degree program. First of all, whichever genius decided to amalgamate those two degrees, amazing choice. I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of nursing education. I really appreciate learning about the past and learning about all the ways that we've come to where we are today. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of nursing. And the reason for that is because obviously our population is changing immensely. We have a diversity of culture, of different languages, and a lot of different lived experiences that we treat in terms of our populations nowadays. I've worked 6 years bedside in emergency practice, and a majority of my population are obviously of different cultures, different languages, different lived experiences, as I said. As well, I noticed that most of the nurses that work bedside, maybe I shouldn't say most, but a large majority are of ethnic minority background. And I hate using the word minority because it does come from a sort of Eurocentric perspective, but they are of, cultured background. They are of people of color that work bedside. And in the 3 different hospitals that I've worked at, I've never seen a person of color in nursing management. And when I applied to graduate school, one of the biggest barriers for me as an immigrant was seeing nobody in faculty that was of color, or a limited number of people of diversity in faculty. And it made me wonder if my lived experience deserves a spot in academia. So I had a question of, going forward, what can we do to increase the presence of minorities in nursing leadership, in academia? What can we do to incorporate theories that are not Eurocentric in our curriculum to change the way that we talk about culture or our patients that doesn't come from a top-down Eurocentric perspective, that doesn't come from feeling like my culture is theorized about in classrooms, or feeling like talking about cultural sensitivity is coming from a Eurocentric perspective, where if my mom, who doesn't speak English, or my family member who's not European or of European descent goes into a healthcare setting, they're not going to be theorized about in the academic setting. So I was just wondering if you folks can shed some light on how we can retain and increase the presence of minorities in privileged spaces like academia and leadership. Thank you.
Fabulous question. Thank you. Who would like to perhaps respond? I'm not looking at anyone. Yes?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond, and I have not a particular prepared response, but I do, first of all, really appreciate the question, and I do think also that no matter indeed how urgent the question is, from your perspective in terms of trying to see how can we move this forward, I'm sort of, as you now by now know, always sort of tending to look backwards. And so I would like in one way to sort of say, no, we are not alone in this question. And for example, when I was working with a fabulous group of people on the history of the International Council of Nurses, which was the very first body of professionally organized women that still exists today, what we stumbled upon, for example, and that is all in the colonial context, is that there still was exchange of ideas. That, for example, when colonial forces and programs sought to establish nursing in China, for example, they discovered that in Chinese there was not a word for the nurse. And one of the responses collectively in collaborative initiative eventually was that from the Chinese nurses, the effort was done to come up with a word in Chinese that signified nursing, and also to begin to organize themselves. So while that was indeed all in a colonial context and could also easily be framed as oppressive or not acknowledging, what I took from that learning was in part that no matter what the circumstances say there, when there is opportunity to be creative, it can also add new approaches. And I think why I just picked this example, because it immediately came to mind, it also is a little bit sort of reiterating the conclusion of my own sort of 10-minute 12 minutes to talk, is that, yes, we have to revisit concepts. So if you identify that kind of a need to sort of say, oh, we have no theory on this, and we do need it, because we want to move forward, because otherwise people are not served well, then we need to step up. And that is also sometimes revisiting older concepts, like culture. We cannot really think of culture without the language of culture, or even teach it. But on the other hand, we can come with what Joan, for instance, said, a critical perspective that is very different than a behavioral one that sort of underlies what is currently very criticized. So I would say, yes, continue to think and to critique. As broad as that answer is, it's a start.
Would anyone? Yes.
Yeah, just a quick comment, not an answer, because I think you have a big question there. But I just want to applaud both your question and your passion, because I think that's what we are beginning to feel in this room about our passion for nursing and our passion for where it should be going. So that question is a piece of that whole question of where should we be going, how should we be going, and how do we do that? And a brief conversation just at the break earlier was about, do we have a common goal? And then, do we have a plan? And I don't think we yet have a common goal. That's a collaborative process that I think takes many individuals and organizations and associations to come up with. But then what is the strategic plan around that? And I hope that you'll be part of that, because you're one of those bright lights that's coming forward in our profession that's going to make a difference. So thank you for your question.
And just as an aside, Annette Brown and colleagues have written a really interesting paper about creating an anti-discriminatory, anti-racist pedagogy in nursing curricula and classrooms. And it's a good read, and so it's just one suggestion. I think, is there one burning question, and then we will finish at that and invite people to chat when we're having lunch.
Thank you. Really warm thank you to everyone. You've been really inspirational. I think it's like we're rising from our graduate studies and kind of moving forward. It's very inspiring to see the panel in front of us and everybody that surrounds us, and to see that there's hope. Yeah, there's a lot of hope out there. I would expand on that, but I'll just kind of get to a comment/question. I've always had a passion for mentorship and now with the critical nursing shortage, it's a global concern, really. But if we're just talking, at least for BC and Canada alone, I'm wondering, how can we, as potential future educators, and people who, like, for instance, I'm interested in health policy, and how can we try to promote the retention of young nurses who are finishing their BSN degrees to remain in the profession? Because I know that when you're at the bedside, you're faced with a lot of challenges that, unfortunately, a lot of them are out of your control. And one of the reasons why I wanted to come to grad school is because I wanted to gain the skill set to kind of influence nurses in the clinical setting, and outside of that to contribute to mentorship and to try to promote recruitment. And so my struggle is that there's a lot of challenges out there for young nurses, and a lot of people who would like to get involved in policy and try to be sitting in, like, the government to hear the decisions that are made. How do nurses, if there's a way, how can young nurses and new graduates who are finishing either graduate or PhD degrees have that seat at the policymaking table? How can we get there?
Who would like to perhaps respond?
Yeah? Yeah, I don't want to be in the situation that nobody responds. But I do go a little thing what I often do in class. Who has an idea in the group? What would be one?
When you were speaking and you're talking about the bedside nurse and those and delivering direct care, I think it's up to management and the educators to find the space for those people to learn how to speak in the setting, about their setting. So starting there, grassroots. We heard how we've lost our voice, or when someone mentioned the magazines are now going online. I used to love to get the magazine in the mail, and then I'd leave it in staff rooms. I leave the History of Nursing magazine in the staff rooms. So starting that engagement at that level would be a place to start. So the seat doesn't come at the table until you learn a little bit on how to manage at a more direct level.
That's great. And I think reminding ourselves of Susan's call to action this morning, I think asking these questions in these kinds of environments, like I find the asking of the question so inspiring. So we need to be getting together and figuring out how we move forward. And the idea of new nurses and more experienced nurses, the idea of us all getting together and bringing what we have is very powerful. So I'm going to leave that with you, Raluca, because I have a feeling that you would be willing to create something and get us going, and count me in. I can only speak for myself, but I think both your questions are fantastic. Thank you so much. Geertje, I'm going to hand over to Geertje. She would like to say thank yous, and then I have a very quick little fun closure. Very quick, maybe it's a minute, I'm not quite sure. It's a limerick. And so...
I'm glad you said that, Kathy, because now everybody wants to wait. Because I know that you are special in that art. But first, before we go there, I would like to really, from the bottom of my heart, thank all of you to bring from various different places and experiences and time frames and theoretical perspectives, the rich history of our school in life. Is that English? And so, for everybody, I have a card. And for Ranjit, for moving us forward, for Catherine, for giving us some theory to think of, and for Sheila, to bring us distance close to home. I was just fabulous, that picture of you being on the TV. That was just great. Marion, for your thank you. And Joan, for keeping us grounded, as always. No, grounded is a negative, hey?
No.
I mean for keeping us into the roots of where we come from. That is what I wanted to say, so, yeah.
And I just want to say that the roots of where we came from, it's really the roots that Susan talked about, and we just built on it. It's a big.
Yeah, and that also, to me, is always energizing, that we have these people to look at. So thank you all.
And thank you to Geertje. Okay, so really, really fast. Well, kind of fast. Okay, and so we all gathered together today to hear what our invited guests had to say. Having scholars so dear was inspiring and clear as they moved from models to educator pathway. First we had Susan as speaker most key. She delighted us with her very strong plea. Learn from the past, just like a newscast, and remember the power when we can all agree. The panel convened with Joan's complex theory, filled with such meaning and presented so clearly. Vision aplenty, a true presentee, our scholars are awesome and respected so dearly. Marion followed with 5 decades of living as educator and colleague, so very giving. Sowed many a seed, a true leader indeed. It's many a pail she ended up filling. I'm drawing out, sorry. Then Geertje presented, guess what, nursing model. Complex as it was, it caused quite a wobble. The language was tense, didn't always make sense, but it laid the foundation that was without a squabble. Then Sheila reminded us of distance ed, and Catherine joined her to check what was said. How far we have come, especially for some, because these waters were challenged and UBC led. Back to the present with Wednesday and wellness. Francis and Ranjit's recruitment was endless. Prevention and foot soaks, a great need for some folks, their efforts resulted in care that was precious. We want to acknowledge our own Helen Shore, whose support for our history deserves a big roar. Not here today, we still want to say, thank you, dear Helen, you could not have done more. It's been great to spend time this morning with you, and now it's our cue for a well-deserved brew. Mingle as one, please have some fun, and perhaps there'll be contacts that you accrue. It'll be time to go when the food plates are empty, but I hope you'll be leaving with a bag full of plenty. Ideas so vast, future and past, next time we see you, it will be 2020.